In every neighborhood, there is always that one person who thinks the homeowners association gave them a badge and a gun instead of just a volunteer position. But in our cul-de-sac over in Silver Creek, we had something much worse than a busybody. We had Arthur Pendergast. Now, Arthur wasn't even on the board. He was just a man with too much time, a high-end digital camera with a telescopic lens, and a burning desire to make everyone else as miserable as his late wife must have been. God rest her soul. He spent his mornings not drinking coffee or reading the paper like a normal retiree, but stalking the property lines with a clipboard and a literal ruler, measuring the height of people's fescue grass as if a quarter-inch of extra growth was going to trigger a total collapse of local property values. My Gramps, a man who survived 2 tours in the humid jungles of Vietnam and spent 40 years running a precision machine shop, had zero patience for men who acted like little kings without a kingdom. And for the longest time, he just ignored Arthur, treating him like a particularly annoying gnat that you just swat away without a second thought. But things changed when Arthur decided that our backyard was and oppos. Just a part of our home, but a crime scene he needed to investigate. And let me tell you, watching a 70-year-old veteran decide he's finally had enough of a neighborhood bully is like watching a slow-motion car wreck where the car being hit is a smug, self-important jerk. It all started on a Tuesday, one of those thick, humid North Carolina mornings where the air feels like a damp wool blanket, and I was in the kitchen trying to convince myself that a bowl of soggy flakes was a good breakfast. Gramps was out on the back porch, sitting in his old cedar rocker, just nursing a mug of coffee blacker than a moonless night, when I heard him mutter something under his breath, a low, gravelly sound that usually meant trouble was brewing. I looked out the window, and there was Arthur, his spindly legs shaking as he balanced on top of our white picket fence, his expensive Nikon clicking away like a machine gun as he aimed it at Gramps' prize-winning heirloom tomatoes. He wasn't just looking, he was documenting, claiming later that the wooden stakes Gramps used to support the plants were, in quote, industrial eyesores, in quote, and in quote, non-compliant structural additions, in quote, to the landscape. I wanted to run out there, maybe shake the fence a little and see if Arthur could fly, but Gramps just held up a hand, his eyes never leaving the man on the fence, and he told me to just wait, because a man who's looking for a fight will eventually find one he ISN and oppos. Prepare to win. The problem was that the HOA president, a woman named Sheila, who wore far too much turquoise jewelry and smiled like she was trying to sell you a haunted house, didn't in oppos. See Arthur as a trespasser. She saw him as, in quote, proactive, end quote. Every time Gramps went to the monthly meetings to complain about Arthur's face being pressed against our windows or his footprints being found in our flower beds, Sheila would just wave a manicured hand and say that Arthur was just looking out for the, end quote, integrity of the community, end quote. It was a classic case of a small-town power trip where the rules only applied to the people they didn't and oppos. Like, and Gramps, with his old truck and his refusal to hire a professional landscaping crew, was at the top of their list. They thought they could bully him because he was quiet, because he didn't and oppos, use big legal words, or threaten to sue. But they forgot one very important thing about men of that generation. They don and oppos. Get mad, they get even, and they do it with the kind of mechanical precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep. After Arthur actually had the nerve to open our back gate while we weren't in oppos, home to, end quote, inspect the drainage, end quote, behind our tool shed, Gramps stopped complaining to the board and started spending a lot of time at his workshop. For 3 days, I heard the low hum of the lathe and the smell of solder wafting through the house, and he'd asked me to go down to the hardware store for specific items, high-tensile wire, insulators, and a few components that looked like they belonged in a radio station. He wasn't into oppos, building a weapon, he was building a lesson, and he made sure every single bit of it was tucked inside the legal gray areas of the local electrical code like a hidden treasure. He installed a subtle, almost invisible wire along the top of the gate and the inner handle, and then, with a bit of a smirk, he hung a small, innocuous-looking sign that said, end quote, security system active, end quote, in a font so professional it looked like it came from a government building. He even registered the modification as a, end quote, pest control and perimeter security enhancement, end quote, with the county paying the $20 filing fee just to make sure he had a paper trail that would stand up in court. The following Saturday, the air was still, and the neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of someone's lawnmower, the perfect stage for the drama that was about to unfold. Gramps was in his usual spot on the porch, his face a mask of calm, while I watched from behind the screen door, my heart hammering against my ribs because I knew Arthur couldn't and oppose. Resist a freshly painted target. True to form, Arthur appeared from behind the hedgerow, his clipboard tucked under his arm like a shield of righteousness, and he marched straight for our gate, probably intending to see if the unauthorized mulch Gramps had laid down was the right shade of brown. He didn't oppose to even see the sign, or if he did, he thought he was above it, and the second his gloved hand gripped that metal latch, the world seemed to stop for a heartbeat. There was a sharp, audible crack, the sound of a high-voltage, low-amperage pulse, and Arthur let out a sound I can only describe as a goat try to sing opera. He didn't oppose. T just let go. He practically levitated, his clipboard flying into the air and his ruler snapping in half as he tumbled backward into a very prickly, very unforgiving rose bush. Gramps didn't oppose. T move, didn't oppose. T shout. He just took a slow sip of his coffee and nodded toward the struggling man in the thorns, saying just loud enough for Arthur to hear that the security system seemed to be working perfectly. The fallout was immediate and glorious, with Sheila from the HOA showing up an hour later, her face turning a shade of purple that matched her earrings, demanding that Gramps dismantle his death trap immediately. But Gramps was ready. He handed her a laminated copy of the county permit and a printed excerpt from the state's stand your ground and trespassing statutes, reminding her that Arthur was on private property behind a closed gate at the time of the accident. He told her, in that voice that sounds like grinding stones, that if Arthur ever stepped foot on his grass again, the next thing he'd be feeling wooden and oppose. T'd be a shock. It would be the cold steel of a set of handcuffs when the sheriff arrived to process the trespassing charges Gramps had already drafted. You'd think a man would learn after getting tossed into a rose bush by a gate, but Arthur's ego was a much stronger force than his common sense, and he became obsessed with proving Gramps was a danger to the public. He started filming our house from the street, recording every time we took out the trash or move a lawn chair, trying to build a case that we were running some kind of illegal paramilitary compound. It was pathetic, really, seeing this grown man hiding behind a mailbox with a camcorder, but the tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone was taking sides. Most of the neighbors were secretly cheering for Gramps, sending us baked goods or giving us a thumbs up when they drove by, because Arthur had annoyed every single one of them at some point, but they were all too scared of the HOA to say it out loud. The climax came on a Tuesday night, during a thunderstorm that turned our street into a river of gray water and flashing lightning. I was watching the rain when I saw a shadow moving near the gate, a familiar, spindly shape draped in a yellow raincoat that made him look like a giant, drowned canary. It was Arthur, and this time, he wasn't oppose. Just inspecting, he had a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters, clearly intending to sabotage the trap that had humiliated him. What he didn't oppose, know was that Gramps had upgraded the system with a motion-activated floodlight and a remote trigger that could bypass the pulse timing and just deliver a steady, discouraging hum. Gramps was sitting in the dark of the porch, a silent sentinel. And the moment Arthur's cutters touched the wire, the backyard lit up like a stadium, and Gramps hit the switch. It wasn't oppose, enough to hurt him, but it was enough to make his muscles lock up just long enough for him to lose his balance and slide face first into the mud he'd been so worried about inspecting. Doyle, or Arthur, as I call him, screamed for the police, screaming about, attempted electrocution, premeditated assault, and within 10 minutes, the cul-de-sac was a sea of flashing blue and red lights. Sheila was there too, looking like she just rolled out of bed to witness the execution of her favorite minion, pointing a shaky finger at Gramps and telling the officers to take him away. But the sheriff, a man who had known Gramps since the 70s, just looked at the bolt cutters lying in the mud, looked at the security system signs, and then looked at the video feed Gramps had playing on his tablet. Crystal clear 4K footage of Arthur Mason trespassing in the middle of a storm with the intent to commit vandalism. The sheriff didn't oppose to arrest Gramps. He walked over to Arthur, who was still dripping with mud and shivering from the shock, and told him he had a choice. He could go to the hospital and then to jail for criminal trespassing and attempted destruction of property, or he could resign from his, in quote, patrol, end quote, move his complaints to a different county, and never look at her house again. In the end, Arthur chose the cowards and oppos. Way out, he sold his house within a month, claiming the neighborhood had, in quote, lost its standards, end quote. But we all knew the truth. He was terrified of a 75-year-old man with a workshop and a sense of justice. Sheila's power over the HOA crumbled shortly after, because once the end quote, enforcer, end quote, was gone, nobody was afraid of her silly fines or her turquoise jewelry anymore, and the neighborhood actually started to feel like a community again. Gramps still sits on that porch every morning. His tomatoes are growing taller than ever, and that electrified gate is still there, though he usually keeps the power off these days, just knowing there's enough to keep the peace. It makes you wonder, though, how many of these neighborhood tyrants only exist because nobody has the guts to push back, and whether a little bit of, in quote, unconventional, end quote, defense is actually the most neighborly thing you can do. Was Gramps a hero for standing his ground, or was he just as extreme as the man he was fighting? Some people say he went too far, that a gate shooting in oppos, TB a weapon, but I look at those tomatoes and the quiet street, and I think maybe a little shock to the system is exactly what some people need to remember, where their rights end and someone else in oppos, as property begins. What do you think? Did the old man cross the line? Or is this the only way to deal with an HOA that thinks they own your soul? Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever had a neighbor like Arthur and how far you go to keep them off your porch.